to Mind Escape. Are you ready?
Are you ready to escape your mind?
Hello, Mind Escapees. If you have not already, please go check out my other channel, Masters of Rhetoric. I will have the link down below. It's also part of the Mind Escape Linktree link. It's something I'm very passionate about, where I dissect the origins of Western thought through the pre-Socratic thinkers, all the way to Aristotle, and I'm probably going to go beyond that as well at some point. So please support Masters of Rhetoric. Go check out our YouTube channel and subscribe. There's tons of shorts on there already, as well as episodes. And there's a bunch of episodes lined up. I'm on all audio platforms with it. And if you're on TikTok, Instagram, X, or any of the social media platforms, please go check out our page on there as well. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Tonight we have an amazing episode. I mean, let's face it, most of them are amazing, but I really enjoyed this conversation. I am joined by Keith Thompson, who is an author, independent journalist, talk radio host, former TV talk show host, and former U.S. Senate staff member. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Esquire, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He is the author of Angels and Aliens, which the San Francisco Chronicle dubbed the most fascinating book written on the subject. And he's also written the book The UFO Paradox, which we'll be focusing on today. If you are interested in Keith's books, please click the link down below at the bottom and sit back and enjoy. Hey Keith, welcome to Mind Escape. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
As am I. I really appreciated your book, The UFO Paradox. I have yet to read Angels and Aliens, but I look forward to reading that as well here soon. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background on how you got into the UFO topic and got interested in this field?
Okay. I'm one person who does not come into it with a UFO experience, on my own that I struggled with, an abduction, like say Whitley Strieber, or and I did not come at it like Bud Hopkins or David Jacobs, the two researchers who work with abductees to try to find a common pattern. I really came at it from the standpoint of really asking fundamental questions about philosophy, about the nature of reality. I've always been interested in those questions. They've always had a really, I guess the word is salience. They've really had a resonance for me, going back to experiences of my own, which led me to start reading philosophers and thinkers like Alan Watts, for example, and to make sense of my own experiences. The UFO phenomenon, well, I'll tell you really how I got into the UFO phenomenon specifically. I'm an independent journalist and author, and I would say one of my first journalistic assignments was as an elementary school student. It was my turn to give a current events report in my sixth grade class. The idea was every student would take a turn to stand up and bring in news clippings, a background of a story, and sort of tell it to the class and why it interested them. And the idea wasn't to do it as a reporter, but it seemed to be a natural way to approach it. I guess I've always had an instinct based on following reporters like Walter Cronkite, the legendary CBS News reporter from the 60s and 70s, I think even into the 80s. I always had a certain draw to their, to telling the news. So in this case, I was growing up in Northwest Ohio. There was a sighting in Michigan around a college campus. And it lasted for about 3 or 4 days, continuous sightings of lights and objects that were anomalous, didn't make sense, didn't fit a pattern. And I told the story to the class about how a Pentagon consultant named J. Allen Hynek, who became legendary in the UFO field, uh, flew into Michigan and did what he was supposed to do. He was hired by the Pentagon basically to be the front to front for, to be the face for the public response, the government response. What he didn't really understand when he signed on to that was that they expected him to explain all of these things away. He, being an astronomer, thought his job was to tell the truth. And he understood there was a tension, that he understood the government was not eager to say there was something in the sky that didn't seem to belong there or didn't have an explanation in conventional reassuring terms. But he said, ultimately, that's not my job. I'm not here to be a front man. I'm here to present my analysis. So he
That was Project Blue Book too, by the way.
yeah,
Anybody listening?
Project Blue Book, and he came to feel he came to Michigan. He traveled around, probably had a driver. He went to all the places where the sightings had happened, including to a place on the edge of town, a marsh or a swamp. And the word swamp is also legendary in the UFO field, thanks in this case to J. Allen Hynek, who concluded that at least it was a possibility that one of the sightings could have been, and he put it very, very conditionally, could have been swamp gas, which is a natural phenomenon in which decaying vegetation around a swamp will give off luminous phenomena. So he, at a news conference, which was called to for the purpose of summarizing what he'd found, he referred to that. He said, it is at least possible. We can't exclude the possibility that one of the sightings in this collection of sightings might have been swamp gas, marsh gas. He was instantly mortified when, before he barely gotten that phrase out of his mouth, when the reporters jumped out of their metal seats, the chairs that had been assembled in the auditorium, and went out to what were in those days a bank of pay telephone calls. They called their news bureaus and said, Pentagon says it's all swamp gas, which is not what he said, but it was understood as what he said. So to bring this idea to kind of bring it home for my own interest, that fascinated me. It fascinated me that he put out something conditionally and that there was such an instantaneous interpretation of what he'd said. It was when even as a young person, 12 years old, I knew that this was part of the story, that this was about stories, what's credible, what's believable, and that people approached this phenomenon with beliefs. They weren't as objective as they thought. So I was drawn into the structure of the stories in the same way that one reads a good novel. If it's a good novel, you want to keep reading. You want to identify with the protagonist's attempt to make sense of the case. So I told my class about this, and when it came time for questions, one of my classmates said, "What do you think they saw?" And I said, "I don't know." I said it very honestly, and it was because I didn't have a dog in the fight or dog in the hunt. Not knowing seemed to me, but I did say this. I said it did not seem that swamp gas was a accurate representation, the best interpretation. But again, that isn't what Hynek saw. I was struck even with my classmates. They didn't want those subtleties either. Yes, but do you think, Keith, it was a flying saucer? Was it aliens? And I kind of stuttered a little bit, stammered. I said, well, that's what some people, that's what some people think. Well, what do you think? At this point, my teacher came up to the front and said, Keith, thank you you've really handled this well. I said, oh, really? She said, yes, you are holding a ground for it's okay not to know. It's okay not to have answers. And she said, class, what Keith is saying is it's important to keep an open mind and ask relevant questions. Follow the evidence wherever it leads in anything, whether it's something that's mysterious and controversial like UFOs or anything else in life. Well, I have to tell you, that was like a benediction for me. It was like a blessing to be 12 years old and to have an adult, your teacher, give you that kind of a pat on the back and say, you've brought a discerning awareness to this. She called me Mr. Thompson. And then she said, Mr. Thompson, you have the makings of a scientist, or maybe a detective or a reporter. Again, follow the evidence wherever it leads. Well, that's a nice selection. A reporter, a detective, or a scientist, all of whom are committed to the idea of getting at the truth of things, at least in principle. Journalism is supposed to look at all sides. Science is not supposed to be wedded to a preconceived conclusion. We've generally thought that's what religion is about. And science was supposed to be a different way of knowing, based on empirical evidence. And the same with being a detective. And what kind of detective would in advance say, well, I'm going to exclude that hypothesis because it doesn't appeal to me? No. Whatever the hypothesis, a good detective doesn't exclude anything in advance. Maybe the butler did it. So I wrote my first book, Angels and Aliens, more than a couple of decades ago. And in that book, I explored the parallels between the phenomena and the figures from myth, especially Greek myth. So, and attempted to show that at that point, all of our best efforts to explain UFOs ultimately revealed more about who we are. That's a big part of my approach to this, is namely that we like black and white solutions, but a lot of life is gray. And I'll conclude this by saying I've been at this UFO game for quite some time, and I'm still not at all reluctant to say I don't know what a UFO is. I know that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is still, the most popular interpretation, but I think there's a huge overlap between these phenomena and the paranormal. And I think the philosophical implications of the paranormal are important, because mainstream materialist science says, well, the paranormal can't be real. Well, why can't it be real? It's a body of data that challenges our assumptions. So in any case, that's really how I began, and I wrote my follow-up book last year called The UFO Paradox, which we can talk about as well.
Yeah, like I said, I identified a lot with the UFO Paradox. I've had my own weird experiences in the sighting, but I'm very familiar with altered states and the consciousness side of things. And even when my cousin Maurice and I were making our documentary As Within, So Without, from UFOs to DMT, I realized there was always an element of weirdness with the sightings. It was never like a fully conscious sunny day outside. There was, I woke up from a dream, or I was under the influence of something, or, there was always something connected to the experience. Very rarely do you hear about an experience where somebody's like dead sober and it's broad daylight and there's a million people around, which there are some, and we can talk about that. You have it in your book, the Rua, Zimbabwe one. But, you explained your origin story perfectly, and I appreciate that you read your own book too for Audible. I think that you have a good voice for it, and it was a good listen. You talk about the Kenneth Arnold sighting as kind of like right after you talk about the Ann Arbor swamp gas stuff, and how the media misinterpreted his words to describe the sighting, and then all of a sudden, that kicked off a misunderstanding. The term flying saucer just stuck, and then, kind of like what you were describing, everybody getting on the phone about the swamp gas, something very similar happened. And as humans, we have a knack for playing telephone quickly.
Yes.
Do you think that this modern myth got kind of set off on the wrong foot? Because later on you describe his daughter saying that he thought they looked more like flying alive stingrays or something along those lines. So do you think that we kind of got this image stuck in our head, and then that got the myth going, and then kind of almost like a mind virus, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. when I talk about the mythic structure of the UFO sightings, people often hear me say, "Oh, then you're a debunker. You think they're just myth." And I go, "No, that's not what I'm saying. But thank you for raising that question. Let's see if we can broaden the conversation. Myth, yes, does. It's common language in politics. My opponent is purveying myths, which means falsehoods, fabrications. But myth refers in its original sense to a kind of story, kind of narrative that goes much deeper than just true or false. It speaks deeply to the human psyche. It's highly symbolic. So I described Kenneth Arnold, who was a deputy sheriff, who was in a private airplane one day, 1947, June, I think June 25th, if I recall the date. He saw ahead of him 9 objects flying in formation. He was a very good pilot. He knew how to configure speed, calibrate speed. I don't remember the speed at the moment, but he said it were going much faster than anything we could make sense of. And so he called into the tower. What I'm seeing looks like this. Do you have any craft that meet this description? They said no. And they said so with a kind of quizzical attitude, like, we know Ken Arnold. We work with him. He calls in regularly. He's a pilot, but he's describing something that makes no sense at all. I wonder if he maybe is a little off. That's really what began to happen. So he landed at one of his, maybe in Oregon. It was over Mount Rainier that he saw these. So I think he landed in Oregon, Bellingham maybe, and already the journalists had, listening to the radio or got word that there was something. So he was greeted at the airport, and he climbs down, the side of his plane and has a impromptu news conference, and he actually said that the objects moved as like a saucer skipping over water. He did not describe them as in the shape of a saucer. That's a relevant point because a journalist made an interpretive error at the time, and said that that Kenneth Arnold had described seeing flying saucers. So I call this the origin story of the UFO phenomenon, and by that I mean in traditional cultures, so-called primitive cultures. I prefer the term primal cultures or first world cultures. Um, the tribes, if you will, anthropology has documented this well. They have origin stories. Each tribe has a story that they came from the gods or their ancestors came from the sky, and so I thought, wow, this is ufology. This is the origin story of the modern UFO phenomenon. The Kenneth Arnold story is like the tale that keeps being told. And the tale that kept being told was that these were shaped like saucers. So people began to uh, identify saucers. They began to see saucers. Now, that raises a lot of interesting questions. Could it be that if this is an intelligent phenomenon, and it appears to have the characteristics of intelligence, is it possible that this it's a shape-shifting phenomenon that decided in response to the expectation that it began to look like saucers? I mean, it's a wild idea. If there's an interactive, conscious relationship with this phenomenon, that could be a possibility. In any case, you're right. Several decades later, in the 1980s, after Kenneth Arnold had died, his daughter, Kim Arnold, came forward and said, I have something to tell that my father did not want to tell at the time, because he was already beleaguered by being the flying saucer guy. And she gave an interview, I believe it was Coast to Coast AM, in the middle of the night. And they said, well, what did your father see that he didn't talk about? She said, my father was always mystified that he had supposedly had seen craft, technological hardware from another galaxy. He never said that, and he never saw it. He told us privately, and he kept it private, that these seem to be living. They seem to be breathing. They seem to have respiration, and they were translucent. The colors, they were like like living beings that were breathing. And he even said they had the beat similar to the human heart. And I felt, he said to his daughter and to his wife, that they were more likely from another dimension of reality that we don't understand. Perhaps they were from what we call death. They were from the realm that we go after we leave this world. Well, that's a very advanced kind of. If he had said that at the time, first of all, what would have happened is there would have been even more doubt about his sanity. He was already assumed to be maybe a little nutty because he's the guy who saw the flying saucers, which he didn't say he saw. He said he saw objects that move like saucers over water. Well, if he'd gone with his larger interpretation, he saw living beings breathing and having the beat of the human heart, and they seemed to be from beyond this world where we go when we die. He probably would have had to take a test, just a psychiatric test, just to keep his aviation license. So he kept that to himself. Here's an interesting part, and this is why I talk about the paranormal. That day when he flew back to Boise, Idaho, where he was from, he got in his car at the airport and drove home. And that night, there were in his house orbs of light moving through the house in different rooms, which had never happened before. So did whatever he saw have some relationship? Did he have some sense of deep connection to these events? Had they chosen him to be the witness? Who knows? But whatever it was, you could say followed him home. He didn't see craft in his home. He saw beams of light, which he also kept to himself. And it turned out his wife had beliefs about reincarnation and had telepathic experiences. So right there, we have a larger framework in which this is far more consistent with esoteric philosophies, initiation ceremonies. Was there some kind of initiation that Kenneth Arnold, supposedly seeing objects separate from him? Is there a bonding that he had with this event that it followed him home? You're probably familiar with the idea of the hitchhiker effect that became famous with Skinwalker Ranch, this
Yes.
paranormal wonderland in Utah that has it's famous for being a geographic location that has a great deal of paranormal phenomena, Bigfoot, human creatures of various kinds. And well, what has been alleged about Skinwalker Ranch and other paranormal hotspots is that when researchers, when they come in to investigate, will go home and they will take the phenomena with them. So this is stuff that I continually try to broaden the frame of reference. The UFO as ET hypothesis has been very firmly cemented in our minds thanks to Steven Spielberg. I continue to believe that Close Encounters of the Third Kind is still the best movie in terms of what he portrayed. And I'll tell you one more detail about that. He worked closely with the astronomer Jacques Vallée, who, as you know, is the one researcher who has tried to open the door to these larger connections decade after decade, saying with his marvelous French accent, I simply do not believe the ET hypothesis is the best explanation for all of the data.
Yeah,
all
Passport
of
to
the
Magonia is kind of a lot
That's
of what
right.
we're
He wrote
talking.
an important book called Passport to Magonia. He was really the first to make the comparison. He said, these do not appear to have begun in 1947. We appear to be dealing with a phenomenon that has a much larger history. And in order to study it, we need to study culture. We need to study folklore. We need to study what we call mythology and folklore. And of course, at the time, many of the pro-ET hypothesis researchers, who are the majority, who had concluded that if they are real, they must be extraterrestrial craft. Well, again, must be. That's not how science works. That's a hypothesis. That's one interpretation. But the expectation was so deeply cemented even before Steven Spielberg that many researchers said, well, Jacques Vallée has lost the plot. He thinks they're just mythology. He said, no, I'm not saying just mythology. Raise your opinion of mythology. Don't say just mythology, just mythological, meaning false or fanciful, or folklore as something that is, what the folk out in the hinterlands. report. So I've become far more appreciative of what the folks say. Folklore means the stories that people tell who do not have necessarily advanced degrees. Doesn't mean you don't have an opinion. Uh, Early villagers in the United States, people out in the folkland, were reporting that fiery rocks uh, were landing in their fields. And the experts at the time said, well, that's fine, but that isn't possible. There are no fiery rocks. If you tell me that the rock that you're pointing to seems to have been involved with fire, that's because maybe somebody burned the rock and is trying to pass off a fake story. What they didn't realize, these were meteors. The meteors were real. They didn't have an explanation at the time. So I use that same analogy to say that the UFO phenomenon is real. It has precursors in myth and folklore. And it's a bigger picture that probably ultimately challenges our views of reality. And that's where I, come down and say that the materialist view of science, while it's been very helpful, is not the full extent of science. It's one approach, and it does not give us any real clarity about what the nature of consciousness is, what the nature of mind is. Materialism excludes mind. So I'm saying the UFO phenomenon is one of many phenomena, including much of the paranormal per se, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis. I say all of this needs to be on the table. If we're excluding that in advance because we want a simple hypothesis, like the ET hypothesis, which I don't rule off the table, but I question the explanatory power of the ET hypothesis. I don't think it accounts for the richness of the data. So to summarize, I would say the UFO phenomenon is ultimately a call, if you will, a call from the cosmos. It's a way of saying your maps of reality are not finished. You live in a bigger realm than you realize. And to make that clear, here's a phenomenon that's going to confound you. And I'm a big believer. Be willing to be confounded. Sometimes being confounded is the most authentic response. I don't know what's going on here. How often do we studying politics right now, following the political scene? I'm very often aware. I don't know what's going on in the current debate between Trump and his adversaries. I don't think I've got enough information to evaluate specific. I'm fine with not knowing. I'm a big advocate of not knowing as a precursor to opening to new knowledge. If you've got all the answers, you're not going to be open to new information. And in the best sense, I'm a science guy. I'm in the sense of science. I don't think science is going to explain necessarily everything, but science in its best sense was, why don't we take an empirical approach? What does the evidence say? And regarding any body of evidence, what are the best hypotheses? And then we can test the hypothesis. So with that in mind, I use the UFO as a framework to ask bigger questions rather than smaller questions.
Yeah, interesting.
By the way, I think the questions take us back to esoteric, spiritual, mystical, philosophical issues. I think the phenomenon is a kind of initiation process and should remind us of the Eleusinian mysteries. Initiation rites have played a great role in the development of human consciousness. And by the way, the idea of the connection between the UFO phenomenon and DMT, I mean, I'm not an expert on DMT and the psychedelics, but I believe the psychedelic frame of reference ought to be brought in to the UFO phenomenon, which is not to say that if you've had a UFO experience, you must have been on psychedelics. It's not what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, the DMT thing too, or psychedelics in general. I mean, DMT we produce in our body. We know for a fact it's produced in the brain now. So it's not like, there's an endogenous component to it as opposed to some sort of exogenous experience or taking something or whatever. So that was the connection there. Not to say that people aren't having real experiences or whatever, but just, the hypothesis of the documentary we made was that the mind is essential for all these experiences, because we don't know any other part of nature that has these similar experiences. Not that other animals or plants don't have DMT in them or whatever, but we're interacting with the world in a very different way, whether it's advanced or different or whatever. So,
Well,
but
and
yeah,
also Andrew Gallimore with a wonderful new book out
I
this
had them
year
on.
called
Yeah.
"The Death by Astonishment." I've not met Andrew, but we've corresponded. He makes a very solid case. He approaches, by the way, the DMT phenomenon as a scientist. He says, I kept trying different explanations. This will explain it. He finally landed in the Jungian world, and he was not a Jungian, but in order to understand it, people said, "Oh, you need to read Carl Jung. Jung's thinking will probably explain. These are archetypes," and so forth. And I don't want to go down the Jungian rabbit hole here today, but point is he what he found is that this is Jung may have something to say, Jung's thinking may have something to say about DMT, but he noted that the DMT experience of these machine elves, these creatures who seem to have these playful, teasing, provocative, elf-like figures that are encountered do not seem to be related like other psychedelics are to the psychological framework of the user, of the traveler. That the basic idea in most psychedelics, of mushrooms and LSD and so forth, is that your mental set and your mental and the setting in which you do a psychedelic journey, the mindset you bring and the physical setting and the emotional setting are very important to shaping the phenomena. What he found, and other DMT researchers found, is that it doesn't matter what the mindset of a person is. They're invited to take a few hits of a vape of DMT, and it's a very short journey. I've not done it myself, like 10 minutes in length, but it seems like eons when you come back, that you encounter what appears to be an autonomous realm, an ontological realm, to use the fancy term from philosophy, a realm of being that is discrete, and it will very often, the first time DMT user will be greeted when they come into contact with these beings. "Oh, it's good to see you again. Welcome back." Wow. They come back and say, I had a sense I'd been there before. So it suggests the realm that we're in relationship to, and the DMT brings it forth. Could the UFO phenomenon be the same kind of thing? In fact, there is you can make an analogy between the UFO aliens and the DMT beings. Are they there? Would Let's just put it this way: they may not be the same, but is there a what do you call it?
Trickster.
Well, an overlap.
Mhm.
Venn diagram. If you do a Venn diagram,
Sure.
you've got the UFO aliens and the DMT beings. There would be a certain amount of common territory. What is that commonality? I actually think of the UFO phenomenon as a series of Venn diagrams. We need religion, spirituality, we need philosophy, we need anomaly studies, we need good paranormal, parapsychological research, we need field research. Just get the best stories and try to look at the larger patterns. Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist, had the phrase, the patterns that connect. What are the patterns that connect phenomena from different realms? That's the ultimate quest of knowledge, is to find. Charles Darwin attempted that when he was he was a British naturalist who enjoyed taking walks. He was a man of leisure, and he began collecting samples, fossils, and noted the birds from this island are similar to the birds on that island. And he pursued those patterns. And the result was the great evolutionary synthesis, which we're still trying to wrap our minds around the implications of the origin of species. By the way, I don't think evolutionary theory has figured everything out. And I don't think it negates the idea of a God or a larger intelligence. But certainly nature does evolve. And I think that the phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon, may be part of can be understood in evolutionary terms. That there's something that is not yet. Our reality as we know it is not finished. It may be it's emerging. There are new aspects of nature that are making themselves known, and so that's another frame of reference I bring to my studies.
For sure. Yeah, no, I love that topic. We've talked about the Eleusinian mysteries, and what was probably going on there. A lot on the podcast. We've had Andrew Gallimore on the podcast probably 6 or 7 times over the years. He's actually in our documentary too. No, I mean, I identify with a lot of that as being somebody that's definitely experienced a lot of these states and compounds and things like that, and had weird experiences myself. There's no answers. And like you said, the best we can do when you're dealing with the mind, since we don't have the way to quantify it all yet, like we do, things in the material world, we just have to do the best we can, use philosophy, psychology, the science and neuroscience that we can, use to quantify, and just slowly pick away at what's what. I did want to go back, though, to the myth aspect of it real quick before we move forward. Do you think that myths arise spontaneously in response to what our civilization most needs to integrate? Like UFOs are a mirror for our technological anxiety or spiritual hunger, almost like Jung, you mentioned Jung, almost like his approach or thoughts on the phenomenon?
Yeah, it's you could say there's a phenomenon called mythogenesis. How do myths emerge? And here I cite Joseph Campbell, his famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He's popularized the hero journey. So he defined the monomyth as the idea that there's a mythic structure that is at the heart of all world myth, and in Jung's term, all psychological myth. Psychological phenomena come down to this idea of a protagonist who goes forth in the light of day and has an encounter that takes him or her off the beaten path. And it is the way nature keeps discovery going. And the hero's journey is understood as the Odyssey. We see it in Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the great mythic structures. That's why we go to the movies. That's why Marvel comics are so prone to powerful motifs, especially for younger audiences. People say, go to the movies now, it looks like it's entirely for juvenile audience. Well, yeah, because we've stopped teaching our young people the great myths. So it's up to them to go to the movie theaters, to watch Iron Man. And so we are drawn to myth. We're drawn to these deeper stories. It's why we pick up a novel at the airport and we read it for 4 hours on the flight. That's why we read a page turner, because a well-written novel or a well-written designed screenplay, a movie that is captivating deeply, it's because it resonates with these deep mythic structures. So I think and I think Steven Spielberg was a genius at that. By the way, let me share something with you about. Going back to, I brought up Jacques Vallée, the French astronomer. He was brought in by Steven Spielberg back in the early '70s to work on, when Spielberg was working on the phenomenon and trying to find a plot that could capture the biggest part of it. He knew about Vallée's books. So he said, Jacques, I want to meet you. Come to me in LA. So they did. They worked together. And Vallée brought a vast amount of field research. For example, the sense in which in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the Richard Dreyfuss character, his truck stops. It stops the engine. It turns off all the lights. And then when the phenomenon goes back off into the sky, the car starts up again. The idea that people all around the world were transfixed by the idea of what was going on at Devil's Tower in Wyoming. That is also a powerful theme. So Vallée brought a lot of that in. And then at one point it became clear to Vallée that what Spielberg was planning to do was have this culminate in the giant mothership. He was going to resolve the plot as a classic extraterrestrial landing. And Vallée said to Spielberg, Steven, it's your movie. You'll do what you want, but if you resolve all the ambiguities, all the richness of the data, which is far more nuanced, as an extraterrestrial event in a definitive sense, you will overly define this phenomenon in a way that the evidence doesn't indicate. And Spielberg said to Vallée, I understand what you're telling me. I've studied the phenomena you've brought to me. I've studied the cases. You're right. It is far more subtle. But here's the deal. I work in Hollywood. My day job is to make movies. People who go to this movie are going to want the handshake. He used the term handshake. You remember the French scientist who used a musical five notes, do 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 do,
Yeah.
and he had the hand gesture by which the connection was made. He said people are going to want the handshake. But I said, Stephen, I know what you're saying. I understand you want to make a great movie, but he did believe that what Spielberg would be doing was making that ending so compelling that people would assume that UFO means extraterrestrial spacecraft. What UFO means is unidentified aerial flying phenomena. Something's in the sky that we can't explain. It could just as easily come from other dimensions of reality, not from just necessarily from a physical place, or it could be some third option. It's from another physical place, but it manifests in terms that for us we can only call paranormal. So anyway, that's an example of the tension between storytelling and another example of it is how the major UFO abduction researchers, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, were both very forthright in a curious way, very candid to say they would learn to exclude cases as probably not real abductions. Oh, really? What would be examples of cases that don't seem to be real abductions, that were probably only psychological? And they both basically said if it doesn't fit the emerging profile of little short gray aliens, the ones that are supposedly 7 feet tall, who don't fit that profile, those probably are just psychological. Well, wait a minute. Whoa. Because you have a lot of sightings that show a preference, a predilection for the short gray reptile aliens. If anything doesn't fit that, they're excluded. What I'm saying is there is among UFO researchers an unavoidable desire to remove the strangeness and to regularize, to make the phenomenon credible. Because, if you're a UFO researcher, if you're an engineer, a professor of engineer at a university, and there are a good number of professors of engineers who actually are interested in the UFO phenomenon. They have a hard enough time selling this as even extraterrestrial. They don't want little elves from mythology. They don't want to hear about parallels between UFO abductions and fairy abductions in the Irish and Celtic cultures. That's way too weird. So I'm not saying that the researchers are dishonest, but there's a natural attempt to rationalize, to make the phenomenon more rational than it really is. What I'm saying is the UFO phenomenon is actually stranger than we think, because there are too many kinds of creatures with too many kinds of morphologies and body types and anatomies. So I'm a big believer in let the evidence be as weird as it needs to be. Don't close down. And I think that these researchers on abductions have given us too concrete a picture. The idea that these are literal, well, the abduction issue is a complex one, and I don't want to do it in a brief way.
We can do that later. Maybe even have you back on and discuss that a little bit more fully, because that's what we looked at in our documentary. And going into making it, when I first started, I've always been interested since I was like 12, 13, pondering the universe, whatever. But when I really got into these ideas and concepts and things, I was much like what you were discussing. Like I'm very about science and observation. How can we quantify these things? And slowly I realized through researching, talking with people, having my own experiences, that there's a far more It's a far bigger gray area than just rational materialism or something along those lines. Like you said, there's a lot of people that want to turn this into a solid flying disc with a physical being from another planet getting out, as opposed to some sort of whether it's our own part of our own psyche or a piece of something or something we're encountering in an altered state that's communicating with something in a different dimension, or something that, it's basically what we're talking about is metaphysics. And that's kind of the conclusion that I came to as well, which is that there's a metaphysical component to this, and that the very few, like I said, rational daylight, whether it's, a physical encounter somebody had or something, I'm actually more skeptical of those these days than I am of the actual people having weird experiences in altered states or in liminal spaces, or waking up or falling asleep, or a light outside and they wake up, or something along those lines, because I feel like a lot of people can connect with that, as opposed to I'm sitting in my backyard and a metal disc lands and some being gets out. Not that I feel like that's not in the realm of possibility. It's just that going in, I felt like that was more likely, as opposed to now where I feel like that's far less likely, if that makes sense.
Well, and that's in my assembly of Venn diagrams, I bring in also the shamanic tradition, shamans. The shaman in traditional cultures, primal cultures, was that figure who was expected and trained, very eccentric, would probably be considered a psychologically disordered person according to contemporary psychological diagnostics. But the shaman was that being who would would light the fire and have ceremonies and conduct discourse, intercourse, if you will. I don't mean it in the sexual sense, but exchanges with the beings from the upper and the middle and the lower realms. Most shamanic cultures have a well-defined cosmology of beings at many levels. When I discovered that, when I found my way into the anthropological evidence of shamanism, I said we can't exclude the possibility that maybe today's UFO abductees are unwitting shamans. They are drawn into the same realms that the shamanic cultures speak of, with their different levels of beings, non-ordinary mythological creatures. That simply because our philosophies and our cosmologies in the Western mind have excluded all those phenomena doesn't mean the phenomena are excluding us. If I often say, when we have a consistent body of evidence, and I mean the whole entire phenomenology of the UFO world, the abductions, the contacts, the visitations, the sightings in the sky, the sense in which the sightings in the sky often correlate with deep psychological experiences that would not necessarily go with seeing a light in the sky. What is it about the sense of a person who witnesses something in the sky and has a transformative life experience that cannot be explained by a conventional light in the sky? So I often say, when we have a phenomenology, a broad body of data that doesn't fit our maps, maybe at some point the wisest question is, maybe it's the maps. Maybe our map. Has anybody checked our maps lately? Are they up to date? By maps, I mean our theories. We don't literally carry around maps with us, but the Western model of science involves theories which are mappings. You could say, in the same sense that the adventurers who came, Magellan and other adventurers who came in ships, they had maps of the ocean, of the sky. Well, our maps don't appear to be final. Whoa, they're not up to date. We don't even include consciousness. Even in the Western materialist framework, we don't have an understanding. We don't even have a framework for understanding the act of observing. We don't account for awareness and for psychological. We don't have a good map of interior life and its relationship to the outer life, which is where synchronicities come in, right? And synchronicity is, by definition, a meaningful correlation between an internal state and a psychological state. If famously, Jung was working with one of his patients who was telling about a dream of beetles, a particular beetle called a scarab. And at one point, while the patient was telling Jung about his dream of a certain kind of beetle, uh, Jung heard a kind of knocking on the window. So he got up and opened the curtain. And there was that very beetle on the window. And that's when Jung began to work with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli.
Yeah, from the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, so basically said we need a model that talks about evidence that mind and matter, far from being two fixed positions, mind is here, matter is here, going way back to Descartes, they don't communicate. These are separate categories. Somehow meaning is entirely inside us. The outer world is composed of dead, inert matter. Well, what we have with synchronicities and other paranormal phenomena, you have a precognitive dream that you're going to be walking down the street and see a person dressed in these colors, and you see a scene which the next day, based on the dream, you see that scene. In other words, well, great. Let's draw bigger maps. I'm up for drawing bigger maps, and that's the true scientific enterprise. It should be the religious enterprise as well, but too often most religions define a given map. It's with a particular book and a particular interpretation of that book, and I don't want to go deeply into that. But I'm spiritually, and I think good science and spirituality are the same enterprise.
Yeah, and Jung and Pauli, I think they came to the conclusion that it was when mind meets matter is what the synchronicity is. Those two different, mind and matter kind of intersecting is like, oh, that's when you have this epiphany or this synchronicity or whatever. Yeah, if you're interested in synchronicities, I implore people to go look into that, the communications and letters between Jung and Pauli, because there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And actually, there's another Jung short story. I think it's Man's Search for Meaning, and not the Frankel book, but there's another one, a Jung one. I can't think of the title right now, where he's talking about a mountain climber that he was seeing him, and the mountain climber came to him he was climbing in the Alps and said, I keep having this nightmare that I'm going to die up on the mountain or die, and Jung said, well, don't go up there alone. So he started going with somebody else. And then finally, I think one day he, decided to just do it himself and he goes up there and dies on the mountain. So it's like, it's one of these things where it's like, was he foreshadowing his own death, or was there something to those dreams and those thoughts? It's an interesting thought experiment.
And this brings up the whole question of what's the role of skepticism and critical thinking. I became aware when I was 12 years old, and I had that assignment to cover this case, or I made that my assignment, brought it to my class about the Western Michigan sighting. That's when I first had the introduction to the debunkers. And by debunker, I mean that class of skeptics who speak in the name of science very often. Carl Sagan was famous for this, and now Neil deGrasse Tyson is sort of the latest TV scientist. I don't know what real science he does, apart from being on TV, and they trot him out as as a representative of science. And generally, in televised debates about the paranormal and extraterrestrials and the UFO phenomenon, generally the last 15 minutes of an hour-long show is, now we're going to bring on the skeptics who basically dismiss it all. So I don't think skepticism, I distinguish between genuine skepticism. Well, like what happened? Tell me your story. Is it possible there's another interpretation? Asking good, critically minded questions, not needing to believe anything in advance, is different. That kind of skepticism is healthy. When someone says, I saw your wife with another man, are you going to say, oh, that's interesting? Or are you going to say, where? When? Tell me how I can find you. I want to confirm that. Of course you want
You
evidence.
just want basic information.
Yeah, this is what good detective stories are about. There's a kind of toxic skepticism that passes for skeptic, and that's the debunker who immediately says, "Well, this UFO stuff is really nonsense." Oh, tell us more about that. Well, because we know that reality doesn't do this. There aren't the speed of light question. They could not get here from Alpha Centauri. All of these could not, is not, therefore, could not, therefore is not. We can't explain it, therefore it didn't happen. What this does, and I got wind of this early before. That's why I went the route I went to study people like Jung and Joseph Campbell and bringing in mythological thinking. It doesn't make it easier to bring this stuff in, but it's important to bring it in if we have if there are phenomena that. But so what happens is with the debunkers, that's what I'm going to stay on that point. The debunker basically says, in response to a witness testimony, that didn't happen. We know that reality doesn't behave this way. This kind of knee-jerk dismissal of phenomena drives the phenomena into the underground, if you will, to the deep unconscious of the culture. So what makes the UFO phenomena difficult, challenging, and ultimately an opportunity to think big is that it brings in the human unconscious, because these phenomena are officially dismissed by the official agents of culture in science, academia, and the news media. There's always the giggle factor. I can't tell you the number of, and I don't mind, I find it amusing, the number of podcasts and media events I've done for this book, the UFO Paradox. They begin with the X-Files music. They bring up the interview with the X-Files music. And I don't mind. I'm always aware, oh, this is where the interview is going to go. We're going to go with a little bit of tongue in cheek. I'm up for that. So it takes a certain amount of calibration to say, okay,
Yeah.
I'm dealing with a phenomenon that is officially has a big laugh factor associated with it, and to me, that's just part of the working conditions of exploring phenomena like this, because there's no way around the fact that debunkers set the terms, and I'm not here to complain about that. The debunkers, it tells us a lot about their psychology. The immediate impulse to debunk a phenomenon is not a scientific impulse, even though it is often done by people who claim to be speaking in the name of science. It's closer to the phenomenon of the Vatican officials who paid that famous visit to Galileo and said, "You've got to stop saying that the earth revolves around the sun when we know that the sun revolves around the earth." And he said, "Well, you don't have to take my word for it. I've got this thing called a telescope, and I look into the sky with it, and you can see, and also my table over here, all my computations. You're welcome to spend the afternoon, and we can talk about my computations." They said no to all of that. We don't want to read your computations. We don't want to look through your telescope, because we know from our faith how the universe is set up. And if you keep saying this, we're going to put you under house arrest. Well, he did get a kind of house arrest, a kind of genial accommodation. They told him to settle down and stop making these claims. Then in the late 1960s, I think, finally the Vatican said, "Oh, by the way, Galileo was right." Oh, thank you for correcting that long-standing error on your part. So, whereas once it was the Vatican who made it necessary, and the Vatican, I mean organized religion in general, made it necessary to have a separate body of evidence called science that didn't depend on faith, where you could challenge faith assumptions. Now it is the people who act in the name of science who are actually far more dogmatic and dismissing this phenomena in advance in a way that is not truly scientific. It's one of the perplexing aspects of all of
Yeah,
this.
yeah, I think for me, what I realized too, I'm not, you see people out there, and I've interviewed Mick West, and I think he's a nice guy. I could see where he rubs people the wrong way, though, in his his quest to debunk these videos and pictures and things like that. But I'm more in the camp of the cognitive bias stuff. So like I've noticed from interacting with the community and stuff like that. I've met a lot of cool people. Most people are honest. There are grifters, though. There's grifters. There's mentally ill people. There's people that are very stubborn, that treat it like a religion, that somebody who believes the Bible word for word but doesn't understand the origins of where any of it comes from, that kind of a thing. So there are people like that in the community. And again, I'm not here to question anybody's experiences or anything like that, but I will say that when I listen to stuff or I see stuff, I'm using it. I'm approaching it through the lens of what I understand about human cognitive bias, whether it be apophenia, pareidolia, just bias in general. Even Dunning-Kruger. I could, fly that plane better, or understand this better, or whatever the case may be. You see a lot of that too. So, it's tough because, like I said, I do witness a lot of stuff online where I'm like, how are even, Facebook's gotten bad, by the way, too, with the fake videos and the AI and CGI.
The AI is hard to tell what's going on.
And it does fool people. And I could see that if you have no experience with any of this and, whatever, but at the same time, it's like if you're looking at this through a critical lens, you have to be completely honest about all the flaws that are there too. So while I love science and I do understand what you're saying about like the Neil deGrasse and the Bill Nye and all that kind of stuff, I do think that there are legitimate scientists that do entertain this on a honest level as well, and those people have interesting ideas of what it could be and what it can't be and things like that too. So,
and many of them will admit privately they don't do it publicly for the same reason that Kenneth Arnold kept to himself the larger speculations, including that he went home that day. His house was filled with orbs of light. That would have been the most self-canceling. That would have completely canceled everything he had said that day about the objects that seemed to be skipping like saucers. So what I'm getting at here is a lot of these researchers who do take it seriously and do science keep to themselves their own. That many of them have mystical experiences. They have profound psychological experiences that raise for them the question of what is real. And I get asked a lot, is my book about disclosure? Do I cover disclosure? My response is almost always, I cover nothing but disclosure. But I don't think I mean by that what you mean. I think the main disclosure is the phenomenon that can do these things, that presents itself in these forms, that cross the boundary between mind and matter in ways that, again, are self-canceling. A good UFO report is going to Whitley Strieber, the author of Communion, the great abduction story of the 20th century, if you will. He put on the map this idea of the abduction experience. He happened to be a very gifted writer. He wrote this book called Communion. He has talked about how if he could do it over again, would he have told all the details of the probing that the creatures did of his body, and the deep embarrassment about many of the aspects. So anyway, what I'm getting at here is, to me, the disclosure is the wildness of the events themselves versus the current emphasis on government disclosure, as if it is certain that the government has the answers any day now. This is if there's a mythos or a narrative at the heart of the UFO phenomenon, I don't know of one that is more fundamental than this one. Any day now, the lid on the government cover-up is going to blow sky high. I've been at this phenomenon long enough to know, and being an older citizen, if you will, that this has been going on since the 1940s. The expectation of an imminent disclosure. The government knows more than they're saying, which, by the way, I believe is true. I don't disregard the idea that there's been government dissembling, hiding stuff. But I think the best hypothesis is, and I know there are people probably listening who might disagree, who really do believe the government has figured it all out, and they're now doing a strategic disclosure in doses we can tolerate. Again, I've heard this for so long. I think that what the government is hiding is that this phenomenon has us outclassed. It does things that
I
that
agree. I don't think
can't
I think,
explain.
and I argue with people all the time. I have friends that believe what you're saying, that we have craft that we've back engineered, and the Bob Lazar and all the secrecy, and I disagree. Like even the Manhattan Project, which was our most top secret project we've ever had moles and leaks, and the Canadian stuff where and we even told Russia about it and they didn't believe. I know was it Roosevelt told Stalin that we had this thing and he didn't even believe him, and this kind of stuff. So like who's the UFO Oppenheimer, who's the UFO Einstein or Niels Bohr or whoever? Like we don't have that. So like that tells me that this is a far stranger, weirder thing. So to think that our government, which seems let's face it, not great at concealing things like that, I mean, and you can make the argument that we're better at that with the military stuff, whatever, but again, look at the Manhattan Project. I don't think that we have this stuff nailed down, because I don't know who are the scientists, who are these intelligent people behind the scenes that are figuring this stuff out, because I have yet to see anybody like that come out where it's like, oh my God, like, and I maybe you disagree, but I don't see this, these people that we've had in the past that have brought us into this paradigm that we're in now coming out and saying we have this or we know about this or whatever. It just seems like you said, we're outclassed, or we're so far from understanding what's going on that we can pretend like we're on top of it, but we're really not, or something along
Yeah,
those
well,
lines.
yeah, there's just so much of it repeated about we have fully intact craft that have been captured and back engineered. Where are they recovered from? Are they always generally on government? Why are there no craft that land in, central? I don't even mean the White House landing. Why don't they land on the White House lawn? That's a old cliche. But why don't they land in places where there are witnesses that take photographs, that they're recovered fully intact craft,
And they
and they're taken
crash. They're
away.
so advanced, but they crash
Yeah,
everywhere.
they crash. And Ross Coulthart, the Woodward and Bernstein, I guess, of the UFO field, the sole researcher, the sole journalist who makes this his thing. Remember the guy Jake Barber 8 months ago, or has it been a year yet? Uh, Newsmax, not Newsmax, but whatever his network is, covered this guy who. Anyway, they don't pan out. Jake Barber was supposed to be the breakthrough, the paradigm shift that is going to now hasten disclosure. And there's going to be and something's going to happen in 2027. By the way, Ross Coulthart says he knows of the location of a craft that is a mile in size, a very, 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 very large craft underground. Where is that, Ross? I can't tell you. Because it would hurt our
Sounds
national
like an
security
Alien versus
standing.
Predator movie.
Yeah, it really does. This is always there's a new movie coming out, the new Disclosure movie coming out in November. A lot of the people who were interviewed in that, I know them, and I trust that they say things like, I have talked with people who have had their hands on these craft. I can't tell you more, however. Why? Well, in some cases, because of their own alleged national security clearances. At some point, it's put up or shut up. So bring it. I think for me, what it comes down to is this phenomenon has become so deeply enmeshed in the national security, intelligence, military framework that it has come to define the phenomenon. And there's a lot of the phenomena that doesn't fit the national security, intelligence, state framework. So, I mean, there are people who are out this very weekend, probably doing close encounters of the fifth kind, trying to call the craft in. I say yes. Okay, now that makes sense. If you really believe, if your evidence is that you are able through the state of your consciousness to invite these phenomena in, let's go for it. That is far more productive in terms of evidence gathering than this refrain of the government has the answers, and by probably 2027, it's always there's always a date that keeps us moving forward with this phenomenon. I've sort of begun to identify those frameworks as, it's kind of disinformation, but it's willing disinformation at some point when we believe these explanations about disclosure being imminent. Again, the greatest disclosure is the events themselves and how they confound our rational categories. That's the disclosure that I try to document.
And I think the other thing that gets lost too is people think of the government as this monolithic entity where everybody's in, communication with each other. And I don't think that's true. I think a lot of these departments have beefs with each other. They're different. They have different people. They have different moving parts. On top of that, they're just human beings too. Like we can talk about scientists just being human beings that use the scientific method, or priests being human beings that have a way of faith or whatever. These are just human beings that work for this entity that they could have their own beliefs. This thing of disclosure could be colored by people that, like anything else. There's people that are Christian or Buddhist or whatever, and they have their own thoughts on life and philosophy and death. Same thing with this. There could be people within the government that truly believe this stuff. With the myth stuff and the mythologizing stuff, I think that's where we have to be careful when you're looking at this. If you truly want to know something, you kind of have to pick apart the myth and understand what was the origin of this myth, kind of like you do with the Kenneth Arnold stuff, because I think that when you go down the wrong path, it colors your future trajectory on understanding. And I think that that's kind of where we've gotten with this, where we've gone so far down the road with this idea of flying saucers being from outer space that now there's so many people that believe that, or at least it's in the zeitgeist and psyche and everything, that it's hard to get out of that. So when you're talking about non-physical states and psychedelics and altered states and near-death experiences and things like that, well, it's like it's hard to get people to shift from that because they're so set in their ways on that, just like people get with religion, just like people get with anything else. So,
well, and my friend Jeffrey Kripal, Professor Kripal of Rice University, runs a division there called the Archives of the Impossible, and he has written numerous books about just about the entire category of the impossible. These phenomena are impossible not because they really are impossible, but because they fall outside the paradigms of what we call possible, and so that they are officially impossible. But he says we must pursue the impossible, what we call the impossible. That's the largest requirement we have with all of this. And so I associate myself a lot with Jeff Kripal on that. And there are researchers. I noticed one of the researchers recently said he believes there are now easily 6 categories of aliens that are making contact with us, and that they are at odds with themselves. So they're not even on the same team. And I kind of said, what is your evidence for that? Not that there aren't potentially such, but saying with such certainty that we now know. See, the degree to which our language says, well, we now know that there are 6 species of aliens, and it's very clear. Really? Very clear. These things get repeated. Instead, they're very clear that they are at odds with themselves. And so the short grays and the tall whites are deeply at odds with themselves. Okay, that's myth making. Doesn't mean it's false, but it's uncorroborated, and it falls out into the realm. So ultimately, this phenomenon poses a great challenge. How do you determine fact from fiction? It ultimately comes down. So yeah, the debunkers have their role. Genuine skeptics.
Well, people are going to listen to this back and forth we've had for the last 15 minutes now and be like, oh, they're they're debunking or they're skeptical. No, what I'm saying is there's something
Yes.
real, and I think you would agree there's something real at the heart of this. However, it gets bastardized or colored in a wrong way, or people are people. We're all flawed, so you have to accept that some people are wrong, or some people are delusional, or some people just don't know what they're talking about.
Well, and I think you can make a distinction between having a degree of certainty. There's something going on. Ontologically, again, it's a fancy word for the division of philosophy that studies the nature of being. What exists? What is real? So there's something going on. It is on the interpretation that my critical thinking comes in. I'm an agnostic about various interpretations of the real thing that is going on. So, yeah, if you just tuned in the last 15 minutes, this Keith Thompson sounds like a debunker. He sounds caustically skeptical, blah, blah, blah. I'm skeptical of interpretations. We need better stories, need better interpretation. I need to hold them more lightly. I don't know if this is exactly true, but I've heard that Jacques Vallée, who I've quoted, this researcher who was one of the first to originally bring in, let's look at mythology. Let's look at cultural reports for hundreds of years and do that within the framework of the UFO phenomenon. He was recently quoted as saying in one of his podcasts, he said, I don't find the UFO discourse fun anymore. He's 89 years old. He's been or 80 some years old. He's been at it for a very long time. When he says this is not fun anymore, I think he's referring to these waves of overbelief at the interpretation level, these expectation that there's going to be disclosure that never comes. So then people then dismiss the whole phenomenon. Because a particular interpretation doesn't pan out, the debunkers can say, oh, see, there's nothing here. There's nothing to see here. There's something to see here, and we need to keep our interpretations reasonable, not rash, not. They need to be evidence-based. So, if there are six species of aliens fighting among themselves, well, tell me more about what's the source of that story. I'm a reporter. I want to track that story. Teach me how I can verify what you're saying. I come at it that way. If I wanted to prove what you're saying, sir, about the 6 species that are at war with each other right here on this planet now, how could I pursue that to confirm what you're saying? They often get very quiet. They say, well, I was told by somebody who's in the know, but he will lose his security clearance and he will be court-martialed. Oh, okay, that one again. Okie doke.
Yeah.
Keep me posted.
And I got tired of that as well. Not that I look, I never had any belief that any of that was going to come out anyways. If anything's going to happen, it's probably going to happen like that movie Arrival, where, something just appears. We need linguists, we need psychologists, we need scientists. Our best people. So, this idea that, that something traversed, the galaxy, but somehow crashed here by accident, and it's happened many times. Well, then they have to come up with this idea, it started happening after we created the atomic bomb, and, it started wiping these things out from other dimensions, and now that's why they're landing in this dimension and turning physical in this dimension. It's just like, there's so much layer upon layer of, I don't want to say BS, because I don't think it's BS. I just think it's people's imaginations running wild, or people putting pieces together, and how could this be true? And again, I have nothing against, thought experiments and talking shit or whatever the case may be. But the problem is when you start debating people or going after people or whatever, you better have some information, some ducks in a row, because I think that it looks bad when you don't, and you see a lot of people looking bad out there. And I don't know if you're on X, but
I am.
I was doing X Spaces for a long time and trying to implement the idea of philosophy and teleology, epistemology, ontology, and integrating that into these conversations. And there was people resistant to it, but there was also people that were also interested in those ideas. And I think that because it's based in metaphysics, I think that's the way you have to approach it, because we don't have the tools yet to quantify that. So what I tell people is, at very least, it's interesting because we're all being subjected to some sort of a mind virus of believing something that doesn't actually exist. That's the worst case possibility. The best case possibility is kind of what we're talking about now, in my opinion, where there's something greater than us that we can't quantify yet that's out there that hopefully we slowly can, whether it's understand it or communicate with it or whatever it is. But yeah, I think that, I just don't like dogmatism. I don't like it on either side. I don't like scientists being super dogmatic and using scientism, and I don't like the complete believer that's unwilling to hear anything else other than what they are, their predisposed ideas of what this could be. So I'm kind of in the middle on all that, and from what you've explained, it sounds like you are too.
Yeah, I am. And as a matter of fact, I did mention, that Spielberg had that enormous impact that Vallée was concerned about. You're going to over-define this as extraterrestrial. Now, by the way, I love the closing of Close Encounters. The ship landing and the human abductees all coming back out, the ones who'd been taken for decades, and they said, "I'm Sergeant Smith, U.S. Marine. My code number is this." Anyway, the powerful dramatic ending. Spielberg is now at work on his next movie. He's doing a movie in 2026. Apparently, it's still on for release. He's calling it Disclosure. So I'm cannot wait to see what Spielberg, who has shaped this phenomenon so powerfully, what he does with Disclosure. Is he going to go? I imagine it's going to be a mix of, yes, disclosure. What does the government know? There are probably going to be a character, a protagonist who's on to his secret, but whose life is in jeopardy because those in the know don't want it to be revealed. That'll probably be irresistible to Spielberg. But by my reckoning, Spielberg is a sharp enough cultural observer to know that there's also an aspect of disclosure that pertains to what we're describing as the metaphysics. That ultimately the disclosure is about maybe our purpose, the larger purpose of life, that whatever this phenomenon is trying to advance our understanding of. This could be a test, an initiation. So anyway, is he going to wisely play the edge between the disclosure of government secrets and the disclosure of metaphysical truths? Because I think they're bound up. I don't dismiss the disclosure thing, the government disclosure conversation. I just finally say, at what point are we going to get beyond the endless prediction? As I say, the oldest.
I would love it to be, by the way, I would love it to be true, because that would mean that we do have the ability to keep secrets and we do have advanced stuff like that. I just don't know where the people that would be working on those things are coming from. They've never seen the light of day ever. There's never been any sort of a real leak, other than these ones that, your Lazar or whatever, it's just, there's never been any real credible person that didn't have some sort of questionable thing attached to them, in regards to that, in my opinion. But again, I'm happy to be wrong. I'm not saying that that's impossible or whatever. I'm saying that everything that I've seen to this point points to that being kind of just like, somebody dangling a carrot in front of a pony or something like that.
Well, let me say this. The famous disclosure case, some ways the paradigm case for government cover-up is Roswell, 1947. Something crashed in the desert near Roswell Army Base in June of 1947. Government first came out with a story that said a disc has been recovered. The next day, it wasn't a disc after all, it was just a weather balloon. And there's a pretty well orchestrated, a pretty well confirmed case that the military official who posed with the remnants was not telling the truth as he saw it. So look, something more than a weather balloon crashed. Was it an extraterrestrial craft in the storm that night, that week? Was it something of our own that went amiss?
Yeah, the military came out and said it was a nuclear detection balloon.
Well, they certainly, I mean, I've talked to people who just are very, very evidence oriented, who keep their theories at a minimum. And they talk about the fact that there's good evidence that the military did go door to door in Roswell after most of these scraps were picked up, raked off the desert floor. If you picked up any of that, and if you're holding on to any of it, you're going to get in very serious trouble. I believe those conversations apparently did happen. I mean, I have no doubt that that's a reasonable. So something was so top secret. They were willing at first to say that it was a flying saucer. That's what they led with. Then they backed off from. That right
Yeah,
there
I've
is
got
a
the
pretty
article
powerful.
from the Roswell Daily Record up there on my wall.
Exactly. It is
Uh,
legendary. And it's a myth. It's mythic. And again, I say Roswell is a mythic case. I said, oh, you mean it didn't happen? No, I just have to come to realize the term myth is so, we need to recover language from sets of assumptions that mythic thinking doesn't mean false. It's by definition, the Roswell is a mythic event. But I find that a phrase that doesn't close conversation. It should enlarge the conversation. So I still don't know. I also don't think we're likely to probably know anything that comes out about Roswell. By the way, what would constitute good proof of the crash saucers? Um,
yeah, you would be
why would it
people
be
would be
believed?
assuming,
Why would
yeah,
this
you would
in
have
our
to
current
know what
atmosphere?
alien technology looks like.
Oh, and what Trump knows or doesn't know about, and he makes playful remarks every now and then, just as Obama did. Obama pretended as, oh, I know what happened, but I can't tell you the full story. Well, okay, that's, you're on with Jimmy Kimmel. Is this the framework in which we want to have this conversation, late night comics? And he's smirking and you're smirking. So what's the smirking? Is it to say that you're furthering the cover up? Or are you saying, in other words, what did Barack Obama, was he briefed? The idea that there's going to be a briefing. Jacques Vallée has come out with the idea that this subject, for whatever reason, is so highly classified that the president is not even considered to have a need to know. That's a pretty
If it
phenomenal
was
idea.
true, I think that would actually probably be true, given the way that our top secret and the contractors and that whole structure works. I actually believe that if it were true, that would be probably true.
Yeah, I
Um,
do. It has a ring of truth to it. So, and Valet often says, as I say, he says, I may be the only one or the longest researcher. I do not know what a UFO is. I say that too. I often say, well, I'm second to Valet. He's been at it longer than me. But I don't know what a UFO is, except that it is a very powerful, it's a powerful force. It involves light. It involves effects on witnesses that create experiences that result in experiences. Partly we have to ask ourselves, is this a real phenomenon that does impact our consciousness by creating scenarios that are believable about abductions? See, I'm often asked by, I was on the Larry King Live, the late Larry King, and he asked me, do you think the abductions are real? That kind of gravelly New York voice. Is it real? I said, well, it depends on what we mean by real. No, no, no. I'm not going to let you off the hook. Is it real? Are people being abducted? So, what I thought of on the spot, I said, Larry, here's how I'd put it. If you or I had the experience that is called a UFO abduction, we would believe it really happened. It is a real experience. He goes, oh, okay. Okay, so I mean, he was actually willing to, he stopped. So I think the abductees are reporting real experiences, but like Plato's cave, the famous paradigm of people sitting in a cave and they're looking forward and they see movement against the walls. What they don't know is that there's a fire behind them, and those are shadows that are being cast. So that we believe the shadows are the primary reality. One of the prisoners gets loose and sees, oh, wait a minute, those are just shadows. The primary phenomenon is behind us. So if the experience of abduction is real, what is at the heart? What is creating? Are they at the level that many abduction researchers say? They are veridical experiences. They're happening just as they say. There's so much about them involving the jump cuts and the loss of time, the missing time, that consciousness is a very important part of this. And when there's a lot of missing time in an experience, it suggests there's an alteration of consciousness that also suggests something real is going on, but don't take it at face value. That is a good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Something's going on here, but don't take it at face value or question taking it at face value. Assume that there may be more going on that is going to ask a deeper set of questions than both sides really want. The debunkers want this to be easily dismissed. The believers in the ET hypothesis want it to be deeply believed. And there's a lot of us in the middle who say something's going on here. Like Jung said, something's going on. Something is happening. Something is seen. The question is what? Holding that what with a greater degree of transparency, openness, playfulness, being willing not to have to reach final conclusions at all times about everything. This phenomenon can really drive the dogmatic mind crazy. And maybe because I don't come at it from that way, people say, you don't seem to have been driven crazy by this. So many researchers who followed this a long time, they don't end up well. And I've actually noticed that too. I think the reason that many researchers end up badly with this phenomenon is because they approach it with an expectation of imminent, rational interpretation. It's all going to be made clear anytime soon. John Keel, Keel, one of the early researchers of the 1960s, said this phenomenon will wreak havoc on your mind. If you want to follow it, you need to have a framework that can hold ambiguities and allow for ambiguities to exist. Because if you don't, if you need everything to be tied down, this phenomenon will run roughshod over you. And I think that's true. I don't say that in a spooky sense. Oh, it will run roughshod. Stay away. No, I don't go there.
Operation Trojan Horse. Check it out, people.
Operation Trojan Horse.
And actually, people most probably know him from Mothman Prophecy because they made a movie about it back in the day.
And he would be on the road. He would be on the road studying this phenomenon. He'd check into a motel, and he'd get phone calls at the motel from people who would not have known he was there. He found himself in a paranormal vortex, in other words. He said, this is not a level 1 ET hypothesis. This isn't just greater craft from another part of the universe landing. This is something that's landing in our psyches. And I am questioning my own ability to stay sane. That was a moment of lucid awareness when a researcher says, I question my own ability to stay sane if I need to believe every hypothesis. So he became a kind of radical agnostic about the interpretations and said, basically cautionary, go toward this phenomenon carefully. Go at it carefully. I would say the same thing. Again, I don't want to sound spooky. I don't want to sound warning. I try to make it an adventure in thinking, an adventure in cognition and asking. Aristotle famously said, philosophy begins in wonder. I continue to wonder. I'm filled with wonder about all of this. And so it keeps me in a place of essentially a positive disposition.
Yeah, no, and I approach it in a very similar way. That's why I wanted to have you on. And actually, after talking with you now, I think and there's not too many people that have these takes in the community. You mentioned Kripal and, there's a few others, but Valet. But like, I don't know. I mean, when I was making that documentary, I had the hypothesis that you have to, almost like use a Cartesian doubt. And at very least, what could be happening on a biological level is whether it's the modern myth of the UFO or the ancient Greek myths and the Titans and, Zeus and whatever. Maybe what we're doing is we're creating these things that, like I said, it's almost like dangling a carrot to further us. And like it's some part of our psyche that we don't understand that's our minds using us to evolve without us knowing, if that makes sense. So we
Yeah,
create this.
part of our mind that we don't even know
Yeah.
exists is beckoning us for. Jeff Kripal often says, I think the phenomenon is us. I have often urged him to unpack that a little better because to say that it's just us kind of implies, oh, maybe it's just something in the social psychology that is. But he's actually saying it's something much bigger when he says the UFO is about us. He
Yeah.
means bigger part of being that we've stopped asking questions about. Therefore, we think could only be other. So that's a framework. Wow. So this is a part of us that is bigger than we know about. Um, which
Yeah.
points ultimately. I'll leave with one image when Whitley Strieber and his wife Ann Strieber, the late Ann Strieber, were after he wrote the book Communion. They in that book he said, if you've had your own experiences, send us a letter, get in touch. So they got thousands. Whitley and Ann Strieber, after he wrote Communion, got thousands of letters from people all around the world. And she came out of her home office one day in their home and said, Whitley, she'd been studying these letters, reading them with a group of volunteers. She said, Whitley, this is about this phenomenon is fundamentally about what we call death. And she used that phrase about what we call death. Didn't say it's about death. It's about the realm that we call death, and that we don't know what that realm. So there's a big overlap with post-mortem and the UFO phenomenon.
I also have deduced that most people that are interested in this topic aren't just interested in a flying saucer or aliens or whatever. They're interested to know what happens when we die. We all want to know what happens when we die. We all die, and we all want to understand that on a deeper level. So I think that from my own analysis, from interviewing all these people and doing over 300 episodes of this podcast, making a documentary, talking with all sorts of people are interested in death. That's what this is. It's all a death cult, if you will, not in that sense, but just in the sense that we all want to know what happens when we die. And I think that people believe that this is the best route to understand that, as opposed to,
If there's a disclosure coming about the nature of reality, I think it's probably as likely to happen less through the UFO phenomenon as we normally understand it. The field that I'm finding a lot of whispers about right now, supposedly both the New York Times and Washington Post, for example, are on the verge of publishing big articles. I don't know if it's entirely true, but if you follow the smoke, there's generally fire. And what they are covering is the near-death experience, because the evidence for it, thanks to resuscitation techniques becoming so advanced, that it is actually one of the most rich, robust data. The number of the growing preponderance, the growing number of credible near-death experiences, people who leave their body, sense the other world, have perceptions that are not consistent with being with the material frame, and coming back with reports of another world and afterlife. That appears to be something that, in other words, it may be the near-death experience may be the case that breaks the paradigm.
I almost died twice in the last 3 years. Literally bled out, was unconscious. And I wanted to ask you this too, which people can go back and listen. I've done episodes on my experiences, but in your book, you talk about your near-death experience. I want to do this Mike's Mind Melters, which is just 5 questions, but can you please just give us a little bit of a brief synopsis of your near-death experience that you talk about in UFO Paradox?
Yeah, I will. I'll give it, and I will keep it brief, and I've hold myself to that. It's an experience I decided not to talk about, partly because I'm old enough that I had the experience before the near-death experience was well known. I had not read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. I did not know about the stages, the tunnel, the encounters with deceased relatives and friends. And I had a near drowning experience. I felt myself, I thought I was rising above I was coming out of the water. And finally, I was struggling for so long, body surfing off the coast of Hawaii, that I said to myself, I'm going to die. I had a very lucid sense that I was not going to survive this. And I suddenly realized I was rising above the scene itself. I had an out of body experience. I knew nothing. I was 20 something at the time, knew nothing about out of body experiences. I saw the body of Keith floating in the water, and I overheard my friends on the coast who had told me. My one friend named Mary said to another friend of ours, says, I told Keith, referring to Keith who was struggling in the water, I observed from this sense of awareness, this vast sense of awareness. I heard her say, I told Keith not to go out. I told him it was too dangerous. I told him to be careful. So I said to Mary, my continuing sense of awareness, who was no longer that body or identified with that body, I said, Mary, it's okay. I'm actually fine. It's all okay. This is okay, meaning this entire thing. I knew that I had died. I was dying, or knew that I had died, and I said to myself, oh, dead isn't dead. That phrase came to me. Long story short, I did not get one of those statements from the larger intelligence, it's not your time. But instead, I went back to my body. I got sent back, if you will, and I came onto the shore, and I told my friends, rescued me and helped me they knew what I had gone through. And one of my friends that day said to me, right after it happened, man, we thought you had lost it out there. We thought you had given it up. And I said, oh God, he understands. I said, I did. I died, but I came back. Understand, they'd never heard of the near-death experience either. It did not exist. Oprah had not put it on the map of popular culture. I didn't know either. So when I saw the look in their eyes, when I said I had died and I came back, I knew they were looking at me like I had gone out of my mind, and that I would now be faced with, I'd had a trauma, I need to have treatment, and I'll come back and realize I had just had a complex hallucination. I got it. And I also said, it's not true. What their interpretation, I know that I had a real experience. So turned out I started to study, and I found out about Raymond Moody's book. I studied the near-death experience. I met Dr. Kenneth Ring, one of the other key researchers. So I didn't have a UFO experience. I had a near-death experience, and that had a profound, as I began to realize, oh, it fits a pattern. There are stages. By the way, let me get one key thing. When I saw relatives and friends passing before me, I did see deceased relatives, one of whom I did not know had died. I had a great uncle, Sam, who I believe was alive. I saw him among the dead. So after my experience was over, I survived it, came back to my body, and was Keith again, Keith in this form. I called my mom. I didn't tell her about the experience because I'd already had enough feedback. This doesn't go well when you talk about it, which is also common with the UFO experience. It doesn't go well when you say you've had a UFO experience. Trust me. Doesn't mean don't, but it does mean you'll face the grilling of your lifetime. I asked my mom, I said, have you seen Uncle Sam lately? She said, oh, did you not know? He passed away. When? He passed away in June. It was 6 months prior to my near-death experience. I did not know that. So that is a level of accuracy. It's one thing to say you saw your grandfather, but you knew your grandfather was dead. Maybe it was a hallucination. But you see an uncle that you have every reason to believe is still alive.
That's good proof too, and I don't know if you've ever read Eben Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, but he had a similar story about, I think a sister that passed away or something no. But anyways, there's these stories of these people that didn't know they had a relative and that relative died and they met that relative in that space, or they had a sister. That's actually pretty interesting. And I think that if anything, let's just say from a skeptical mind, what could be happening in that experience that would cause that? I couldn't think of anything, and I've had my own brushes with death as well. So, yeah, I mean, so did when you came out of it, Did you have any sort of like remorse that you came back? I know some people are like they wanted to stay in that realm, or that's actually more common, I think, with people that have their heart stop. I don't know if your heart stopped, but
I don't know exactly what happened. I don't know what my
okay,
physical status was, but I
yeah,
do know I did not have that because I did not have many people long to wish they could go back because they come back so badly injured from something, automobile accident, they're crippled, they have injuries, they find life hell. I didn't have that experience. I will say I did have one of the other confirming aspects of this was, as I say, I heard my friend Mary on the shore, way beyond my hearing ability. It was not my body in the water that was hearing her say this. She said, I told him that it was unsafe. I told him to be careful. I told him not to go out there. So after I survived the next morning, after having a night of rest and food and watching movies and keeping to myself the powerful experience that I'd been through, said to my friend Mary, could we go for a walk? I want to talk with you. She goes, sure. So we went for a walk, and I said, I heard what you said on the beach. She said, what are you talking about? I said, yesterday, you stood there with Moore, another friend of ours who was on this trip. We were all in our 20s. We were body surfing and stuff. I said, I heard you say, why did he go out there? I told Keith not to go out there. I told him it was too dangerous. I watched the blood drain from her face as I told her that, because we were both in our 20s. We were not in touch with philosophy of mind. We didn't know about the near-death experience. We didn't ask questions about the nature of consciousness. But we both knew that if I had overheard her, then the game conditions that we call reality are different. I'd had a paranormal cognition. She knew it. And therefore she said, so you did have this experience. Maybe you did die. And she didn't know about the near-death experience either. So there was a coming back. Part of what this is a larger conversation, but whether it's UFOs, near-death experiences, paranormal experiences in general, one of the um, things that happens when one has these, if one is lucky, you get to you begin to ask new questions. I began to read Alan Watts, for example, the philosopher who's written such popular books
I love
that
Alan
brought.
Watts.
Yeah, so and he's one of the best. Watts, for those who don't know. Um, I began to ask spiritual questions. I began to read esoteric literature. I began to practice meditation. So I got on a kind of path that I would not have gotten on. And I think this is an untold story of our time, that people are having anomalous experiences of realities beyond our framework, and they evoke deep metaphysical questions. So that larger question is, these experiences provoke larger inquiries into the nature of reality. And that to me is one of the added values. I mean, I'm not the same person as I was before my near death experience. Or being with my mother in a hospice and I'm convinced, watching her relatives come and come to get her. I saw in this hospice room, while as I lay there with my mother, this is after my own near death experience, I saw beings, filmy, diaphanous, vaporous beings approaching my mother, and I saw her face. I saw her smile. I did not know about near deathbed visitations, and after I had the experience, I started reading about those too. I said it's a common thing that the dead, already dead, come and take you to where they are. Where is that? Is it right here, but in a larger set of dimensions? I'm inclined to think it is. I think the dead are actually very close to us, but they're separated, and people have experiences of their mother or father or other. It's because it's a frequency issue, and sometimes you just find yourself on the same frequency, and your mother comes and says, "I'm fine," or dad says, "I'm great. Keep up doing what you're doing." Um, those are
Yeah, it's
powerful
interesting.
experiences.
Yeah, and especially what I know too about the people reaching out towards their loved ones at the end and saying final things like, "Oh, I'm surrounded by this person or that person." So yeah, it's super interesting. And actually, this is something that we've tossed around my cousin and I making for our next documentary something on the near-death experience, since I've had one. My mother had a traditional near-death experience, and it's definitely something we've talked a lot about on the show. But I want to pivot. Let's start to wrap it up here. I want to do Mike's mind melters, and then wrap it up after that, if you're okay with that.
Sure, let's give it a shot.
Are you ready to melt your mind, Keith?
All right.
All right. I'm going to ask you 5 philosophical questions. Just answer them the best that you can, and there's no right or wrong answer. Number 1. What is something you believe in that you know is probably wrong or illogical, but you are just not being honest with yourself?
Whoa, what is something that I believe in that is probably not real? Is that what you said?
Yeah, like wrong or illogical, like somebody that believes in God, but deep down they might think that there's nothing there, or something along those lines.
Boy, that's a good one. I don't have an immediate response. I have an error in believing people are more open than they really are, and I tend to be surprised at the unwillingness of people to question their confirmation bias. Not that I'm 100% accomplished in that realm. I have my own confirmation biases that I don't know about, but that, when you have what is it? You have cognitive dissonance, something that tells you what you're seeing is different from what you're seeing isn't accurate. How do we respond to that? I generally say, oh, if there's new evidence, maybe I should question my confirmation bias. Maybe I should question what I believe. And I think that I might be more inclined to think people are willing to question their deep biases than they really are.
Okay, that's a good answer. I'll accept that. Number 2, do you think there is an objective purpose for humanity? And if so, what?
I think there is purpose for humanity, and I don't think it's a single anything. I think meaning is deeply based. This is a universe of meaning. It's a meaningful place, and we're here to learn. And this is not the physical game. The physical world is not the final anything. It's a realm that I think the soul, if you will, the deepest part of who we are, chooses to come into this realm to learn about limitation. You know, there's the sense in which that we wonder when you have a mystical or a big experience, a peak experience, you sometimes realize there are no limits. But in fact, what you're having then is a soul experience. And I think the soul, that limitless place, comes here to learn something about life in form, that and limits and boundaries that are difficult. And that's what suffering is about, coming to terms with those boundaries that make no sense to us. Why do people suffer? Why, if there is a God, is there such cruelty? These are deep curriculum questions.
I like it. Number 3, do you think humans are special or separate from nature? If your answer is yes, give me your best example or explanation of why.
Separate, there's something we bring to the game that is implicit in other animals, primates, dogs, and cats. They're aware, and we're aware, but we're aware that we're aware. We have what's called metacognition. We know that we know. And it's the source of great suffering, because you can sit and ruminate. Why did I do that when I could have done this? I should have known better. I did know better. Kind of the Woody Allen character that he plays in all of his movies, the constant ruminating about what I should have done, could have done, didn't do, did. Rodney Dangerfield. So there's a dilemma of we are aware that we're aware, and we can reflect on our experience. I think that is, I don't see it in dogs and cats, although I see dogs and cats as very aware. If you don't see awareness in dogs and cats and primates, you're not paying close attention. So we are different. We are the next level of of a kind of consciousness that includes knowing that we are conscious and learning to live into that. That's the growing edge.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, a lot of people give answers, but there's a lot of proto versions of things that like tool making and like recursion and things like that you could point to, but there's a lot of proto versions of things that we do that are found in animals and primates and things like that. Number 4. What do you think happens when we die?
I think what I had in my near-death experience, I think the near-death experience is a paradigm for what we do. We separate. We see the body. We see others around us. We don't often know what they're so concerned about. And I think the uncertainty is whether the Buddhist and Hindu traditions speak of reincarnation, cycling of lives. The Christian and Islamic traditions speak of a heaven that's a static place. So which is it? I don't necessarily think it is one or the other. I think partly it's your belief system. Where I saw family in an afterlife, it could have been it could be where part of my ancestors are. That's one of their bodies, the spiritual body, an energy body, maybe is in a place like heaven. Another part of them may reincarnate. I tend to feel there's a pretty good body of evidence for either reincarnation in the human realm or, depending on the degree of spiritual knowledge and freedom. I think let me summarize. I think the state in which you pass, the what's called, the Buddhists call, the Bardo realm, the degree to which you stay lucid in that place as you see enormous possibilities of things to re-identify with. On your way out, identify with the light appears to be a common theme. And by doing so, you'll have an adventure. I think there is a post-mortem adventure. I think what we take from this life into a post-mortem, subtle-bodied life is very much worth considering. I think the proper distinction is not between life and death, but birth and death. I believe life continues, survival continues beyond birth and death, for sure.
I like it. I mean, there's tons of possibilities and infinite possibilities in waking state and life. Why wouldn't there be in death? Final question. This is my favorite quote. 2 possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. Arthur C. Clarke. And I think I have an idea of what you're going to say, but do you think there's life elsewhere in the universe, or do you think we are alone? And let me change that a little bit, because I know now your thoughts on metaphysics and dimensions and things like that. Do you think that there is life elsewhere in this physical universe that we can quantify and see or examine, or do you think that we are alone?
I think that the most probable is that there's other life. That is just, when you grasp the enormity, and I don't know how many billions and billions and billions and billions, Carl Sagan used to love that kind of language, but stars and galaxies and so forth. It seems to me far more likely that something we call life is quite common. But it is also, where are they? Where are they? So there's something poignant about our sense of being so alone and of being unique, but it may be a regional belief. So that's kind of where I'd land with that. I think it's probably, the odds are that life is profligate. It is very numerous.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, statistically, that's what the evidence gets behind. But, you never know. What if we were the first? We're the ones that are going to spread the seed across the universe, if you will, or, something along those lines.
I think it's in one of the schools of Buddhism that says the human birth is an incredible opportunity, because the beings lower than us often don't have enough consciousness to even aspire to anything higher. And the beings higher than us are just so enjoying of being in a bliss state that they don't have any motivation. There's something about being in this in-between realm for humans where we have enough motivation to aspire to something larger that is actually part of what we already are. I like that. I like the idea that that middle realm uh, between the two is what it means to be a human being. To
Yeah,
ask about questions of meaning and to pursue questions of meaning as one of the most noble things that we can do and be.
I like that. And I appreciate you answering all my mind melter questions. And listen, man, I want to wrap it up here. We've been doing 2 hours, which didn't feel like it was 2 hours, but I'd love to have you back on in the future. There was a lot of stuff we didn't get to. We didn't really touch too much on the Kripal's research or the Rua Zimbabwe sightings and things like that, and the angels and aliens. Maybe we can talk a lot about that. Maybe next time I get you on here, because there's just so much to talk about with this topic. And I feel like these kinds of conversations are at a premium because I think we both know the other kinds of conversations in the nightly, 800 number style UFO shows with the people calling in, and there's nothing wrong with that stuff either. But I just think that these ideas in the way that we talk about this stuff, whether philosophically or using in the context of metaphysics and things like that, I think that these conversations need to occur more so people can hear other possibilities and other ways to talk about these things.
Well, I love your approach, Mike. That you have a long form interview style, and it's who would have thought, that the podcasting phenomenon would come along to make it possible for the old fashioned long dialogue symposium type conversations could happen with the frequency that this medium is making possible. So thank you for what you do.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate you sharing your time and your research and your personal stories and stuff, and even your near-death experience. A lot of these things can be very personal. Some people don't even share them. So I appreciate you sharing all that, and I appreciate you being an ambassador to the more intellectual side of these topics. And like I said, I'd love to have you back on sometime in the future, maybe sometime after the new year. We can get you back on here and discuss all the other stuff. And we're going to end this one the way we end all of our podcasts, which is we love everybody, stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time. Peace. If you would like to support Mind Escape, there's many ways you can do it, but the best way to do it is to click the Linktree link down below. I have everything from merch to our Patreon page. Our Patreon, by the way, I archived a lot of the Mind Escape 1.0 episodes on there. There is still some available on our YouTube channel and our Spotify and Apple Podcast. However, like I said, if you're looking for a specific older episode, it might be on our Patreon, which has been archived, and it's $2 a month. And there's also exclusive content on there as well that was never released to any other platform. So please go check that out. You can also check out our documentary that Maurice and I made a few years ago called As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT. That is available on there as well. There's also a director's cut. Video versions of Mind Escape New Telos are available on YouTube and Spotify, and it's also available on all audio platforms like Apple and whatever other audio platform you use to listen to your podcasts. So please subscribe, like, and follow us, and we'd also appreciate any nice review.